Uh, Welcome everybody to today's webinar, CitySwitch webinar on staff engagement, 2 steps to create change. Today we have Mark Boulay from the Monash Sustainability Institute, the Green Steps of the Monash Sustainability Institute, presenting today's webinar. And I want to welcome everyone from right around the country. It's a two-part webinar series focusing on staff engagement for sustainability, which is something that CitySwitch participants were particularly interested in learning more about. Mark has presented this as a workshop, but we thought we'd make it available to everyone around the country in a much more accessible format. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please put the questions in the text box on your right, and Mark will address them at different junctions throughout the webinar. We'll also refer to a couple of CitySwitch resources at the end, which are focused on engaging your staff and green teams. So without any further ado, Mark, I'll let you take over.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome everybody again to this webinar. As Paul said, he'll be referring to some CitySwitch resources that we've got available on this area at the end of the webinar, but we thought we'd put up the CitySwitch web link for you anyway now, and a lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about, there are resources on the CitySwitch website for you to access that will assist you in staff engagement, behaviour change, and so forth. We will also be keeping people on mute throughout the webinar just to reduce interference, and as Paul said, if you do have a question, please type it down, and I'll try and break halfway through the webinar today, and then also at the end to make sure that we're answering any questions that you have. And we'll put out a call to questions a couple of times just as a reminder. So today's webinar, there's 4 things that I want to be talking to you about. Obviously the context here is staff engagement, and the provocation is 2 steps that you need to take to design a successful staff engagement program, particularly one that has a focus on behaviour change. So the first thing I want to talk about is some behaviour change 101 stuff, and that is to understand some of the influences or the range of influences on human behaviour, and how we as change agents and organisations need to be aware of them, and also potentially could even utilise some of these influences to create the change that we'd like to see. Then I want to get a little bit more specific and talk about the importance of, as the first step of a good behaviour change staff engagement program, of being clear on what the ask is. So defining the ask of a particular program. Then I want to talk about talking to staff as the second step to take. Once we know what we want of them, before we then go for the posters and the tools and the resources and the emails and other things to engage them, we actually need to talk to them first to understand what we want them to do from their perspective, so that we can design into any particular barriers that they might have, as well as any particular benefits that they could see coming to them from that particular behaviour. And last, I want to talk about, just to give you a little cook's tour on some useful tools and ideas that might support you in your own journeys of staff engagement and behaviour change in relation to energy efficiency. And at the very end, we'll show you, as I said, a slide which highlights some of the resources that are available to you through the CitySwitch program. But first, it's probably important for us to understand, or to set some context for us on why should we're interested in energy efficiency. We're interested in energy efficiency in primarily offices and other commercial buildings. Why do we need to worry about staff engagement and behaviour? Wouldn't it be easier, and I imagine that some of you would have thought this from time to time, wouldn't it be easier just to put in a whole bunch of whiz-bang technology and let that do the energy efficiency work for us? Why do we need to engage with people, and why do we need to focus in on their behaviour? And I guess the answer is 2, maybe 3-fold. First, you can design the most amazing 6, 7-star, Green Star rated buildings, but if 1-star staff are going to be utilising the infrastructure, the equipment, within that particular building, if they're not behaving in appropriate ways and using this technology appropriately, it's not going to be fully realized. So you can have the most wonderful technology, but if people aren't behaving in ways that complement technology, you're never going to realize the potentials of that technology fully. The second is that behaviors, if you like, define a culture. And you obviously are looking for an energy efficiency culture in your organizations. And it's the day-to-day behaviors that people walking into this organization see that demonstrate to them what the culture of the organization is. So if you're interested in culture change, to again support some of your other sustainability or energy efficiency initiatives, to make a visible presentation of your culture and your sustainability endeavors to the outside world, you need to obviously get your staff walking the talk in terms of the way that they behave. And obviously there's opportunities here from a broader environmental perspective that if people have their behavior influenced or changed in certain ways in the workplace, there's possibilities that they could then be bringing that into the home, into other situations as well. So that's part of the leadership, I suppose, of your organization too. So hopefully this sets some context for us in terms of why we need to be focusing in on staff engagement and behaviour. And actually there's a fourth here too. We would probably love to all put in or newly design 7-star rated buildings. The reality is a lot of us are in existing buildings, are renting existing buildings. That opportunity is not there for us. There's a substantial cost, not just to that, but also to the whiz-bang technology. And you may not have that capital cost, that capital available to you to meet that, to be able to implement this new technology, whether it's new lighting systems, new power management systems, and so forth. So because you don't necessarily have large amounts of capital lying around for these types of projects, the alternative for you then becomes one of engaging with staff to get them to reduce their energy consumption through behaviour change, which is a cheaper option, yet we need to also be aware it's in many cases a longer running initiative as well. It's easy to change lights over, that's a one-off. When it comes to behaviour change, we talk about an ongoing process in many cases, and that's important for us to think about and realise before we get into staff engagement and behaviour change program. Yes, it's probably cheaper than infrastructure and technology upgrades, but you're looking at something which will roll out for a much longer period of time, needs to constantly be monitored and evaluated, and comes with its fair share of grey hairs and frustration as well. So hopefully that set the scene for us in terms of why. Let's look at now a familiar, probably to you, program logic that is often followed when staff are engaged in organisations on sustainability issues generally or energy efficiency more specifically. And this is the logic that's often followed, is we need people to change their behaviours around energy efficiency. So let's say we need to get them to turn the lights off. So we'll provide them with information, and it might be a pamphlet, it might be an email, about the issue. And that issue could be as broad as climate change and the need to do something, or it could be about energy prices going up and our organisation needs to save energy. The logic is then that once they have that information, once they have that knowledge, that will raise some kind of awareness, maybe change an attitude, and then as a result, they will turn the lights off at the end of the day. Now, I'll give you a moment just to pause and reflect on how often you have seen that program logic actually work in either energy efficiency initiatives in your organization, sustainability initiatives more broadly, or any kind of behavior change initiative, in fact, where you want people to do something. And you'll probably note that this logic doesn't, in your experience, actually in a lot of cases work. In some cases it might. You may find that people just need some new information about a particular issue that'll raise awareness about the need to act, and then they'll act accordingly. Yet I would argue that, frustratingly, that logic is not one which is followed. Things get in the way which interrupt that logical flow. And even though people know about a particular issue, they have all the knowledge and information that they need for it, they may even have awareness of the particular issue that's resulted, they may be supportive in their attitudes to it as well, them actually then turning the lights off, turning their computers off, or any other thing may not happen because there are things that get in the way. And ultimately, obviously for us as change agents, this is incredibly frustrating. Yet despite knowing this from our experience, I still see organizations time and time again follow this particular logic when it comes to engaging with staff around behavior change issues. So we want to let's break that today and look at some other things to do instead. Before we do that though, just to again highlight that pretty much this idea of knowledge and information as driving behavior change is kind of becoming, by the research and through the literature, more and more disproved. There's a gentleman, his name is Ichek Eisen. He's a psychologist working at Harvard University. And he's been working in this area of psychology and behavior change, particularly around health promotion, for a number of years. And a few years ago, he and a group of colleagues reviewed a number of behavior change programs around the world, particularly around health promotion, to see what works and what's not working. And this is the conclusion that they came with. And I'll read it out because it's quite a dense slide. They concluded that many educational campaigns are focused on providing people with information. And it's expected once people have an understanding of the issue, they will then engage in the desirable behavior. But information is neither necessary nor sufficient, and indeed it can be irrelevant to decision making. So let's think about that for a moment. It's saying that information is neither needed, it's neither necessary, it might not be enough, and in some cases, it could be completely irrelevant to how people then act and completely irrelevant to their behaviors. And again, as I said, we know this from experience, the research is clear, and yet we still keep going back to providing people with information and getting frustrated that things don't happen. So let's explore some of the things then that get in the way of that particular logic. What are the things that are actually then influencing people's behaviors? And it's been found that there's a range of those. I want to explore very briefly two with them and then give you some categories of what have been considered now to be common behavioral influences. The first influencer that has been identified, and you'd know this again from your personal experience, is the influencer of peer pressure, social norm, what everybody else is doing. And I Googled social norm and peer pressure into my search engine, and this was one of the first posters that came up, and I loved it. Just showing how powerful other people are in influencing the way that you act on the day-to-day. And that is regardless of the information, your attitudes, your awareness of particular issues. We tend to go with what the rest of the crowd is doing because A, it takes guts to stand out. We don't like it. And B, there's usually a safe bet that what everybody else is doing will have benefits for us as well. It's the safer option. So we are primed to respond behaviorally to what everybody else is doing. And that's been found to be a major influencer in our behavior. And from your own experience, I'm sure that will be very obvious. But there are other influences as well. This is one of my favorite influences that has been found. And it actually comes from a book called Nudge, which I'd recommend to you, written by a gentleman called Richard Thaler, Thaler. Nudge is the name of the book. This example comes from the men's toilets, of all places, at Amsterdam Airport. And they were finding that the cleaners were protesting because they were spending a lot of time cleaning up unsightly spillage underneath the men's urinals. And it was taking time. It smelt. It didn't look good, and they felt they had to do something about it. So they put the sticker of a fly on the urinal, and they found that that was enough to reduce the amount of spillage underneath the toilet, underneath the urinal, by 80%. I don't know how they measured it. I wouldn't have wanted the job of measuring it. But the point here is that simply by giving men something to aim at, it reduced the amount that they spilled. Now, what I want you to learn from this is not the disgusting habits of men in toilets, but what I want you to learn from this is there was a subtle tweak to the environment which unthinkingly influenced behaviour. And what this shows is that our behaviour is influenced by the environment around us. And in some cases, with subtle tweaks to that, you can actually influence people in the way that they behave. And the classic example from sustainability obviously is, where we might put light switches or recycling bins or so forth. The location of these things can influence people's behaviour, again, without them knowing, having information about an issue, knowing about an issue, and so forth. So two very simple examples of some of the range of influences that affect human behaviour on the day-to-day. In many cases, unthinking as well. In many cases, they're unconscious behaviours. I mentioned Nudge as a great book to read. There's another fantastic book by a gentleman called Robert Cialdini, and the book is called Persuasion, the Psychology of Influence. Another fantastic resource that I would recommend to you, which really looks at the range of behavioural influences that have been found mainly through research over the years, and often through areas such as health promotion, as well as sales and marketing and so forth. And it's a really great compilation of all the different influences that have been found. There was another researcher in the UK who tried to categorise what he saw as being the main influences of human behaviour. And he came up with 6 categories. And those 6 categories are pretty broad, so there's a range of probably more specific subcategories that sit within these, but they're useful for us to get a bit of an overview of the different influences of human behaviour. So what this researcher found was that, look, of the 6, yes, attitudes in some cases can play a role in influencing our behaviour. In other cases, though, it's what everybody else is doing. It's social pressure being an influencer of our behaviour. In other cases, it's our capacity to actually carry out the behaviour. So that's the skills and knowledge we have to carry out the behaviour, not skills and knowledge about the broader issue, such as climate change, but skills and knowledge to carry out the required behaviour, such as setting the power management settings of a computer. We mentioned the environment. That's what the external constraints category is how the environment is set up, the way that the infrastructure has been structured, which may allow us or prevent us from behaving in certain ways. Our habits is an important influence of behaviour. You have to repeat a habit. You have to repeat a behaviour in some cases up to 200 times before it becomes an ingrained habit. And I'm sure you would have examples of that from your own life. And we need to be mindful of that when we're engaging with staff, because sometimes around energy efficiency, the things that we're asking them to do are new behaviours, and yet we only give them one chance to have a go at it. We need to give them a number of chances to practice this particular behaviour until it becomes an unthinking habit. And the last category that was found was the emotions. So how you feel on any given day will influence your behaviours as well. Well, has an influence. So there's 2 things I want you to get from this. One is there are a range of categories of influences of human behaviour, and a lot of them have got nothing to do with people's knowledge and the information that they have available to them. That's one thing. The second thing is this, in some cases, could explain why people aren't following through on particular behaviours that we want them to do, so it kind of helps us with our frustration. 2, it may also give us some possible levers that we could be utilising here to actually get the behaviour change that we'd like to see. And the third thing to take away from it here is that these things don't all happen to one person for any given behaviour. You have different influences for different people in different contexts based on different behaviours. So in some cases it might be the social pressure which gets people to do something. In other cases it might be the capacity. So these influences work with different audiences in different ways. And we need to find out what those are. So that's a good segue into then, from taking this basic understanding, how do we then programmatize it into a staff engagement or a behaviour change program? And what I want to tell you is, based on this, there are 2 steps we need to do first before we start actually designing a particular program. I should acknowledge my colleagues at the Monash Sustainability Institute work for a program called Behaviour, and a lot of this sort of background information, as well as these 4 steps that you see in front of you, come from their work, and it has been adapted from their work as well. They argue that if you are going to be designing a behaviour change intervention for a group of people, in this case your staff, around a particular issue and getting them to do a particular behaviour, there are 4 things that you need to do. And I want to focus particularly on the first 2. The first, you need to clearly define what you want them to do. So define the behaviour, define the ask. The second is to then talk to them about that behaviour, to understand it from their perspective, both what gets in the way as well as what might actually enable them to carry out the behaviour. Then, when you do those, because they give you a better insight into some of the things that we just talked about, then you're ready to select the different tools and resources and strategies that are already out there. You're ready to then design something appropriate. But you've done the reconnaissance and you've been clear about what you want people to do. And last, you evaluate, because as I said before, behaviour change it's an ongoing process. And change happens by degree. It usually doesn't happen from 0 to 100%. And in many cases, you're having to tweak and change programs throughout their delivery rather than just set and forget. So evaluation and constant monitoring is also important. So I want to go through these in a little bit more detail. But let me first check in with people as well. And there's been a couple of questions that have come up, and I want to answer one in particular. Well, someone asked, would cultural differences fit in under attitudes? So I'll just flick back just to remind you of the categories that I talked about. Cultural differences, I think, would actually fit in under 2, and 2 of the categories. And remember, they're kind of broad categories. They probably would fit in under attitudes, but cultural differences also have a social element to it as well. So your culture, i.e. what everyone around you is doing in your particular home or your particular city or your particular country, is a social aspect too. So cultural difference is a social pressure and would probably also be an influencer then on attitude. So I'd say it probably would come from both. There was another question that's come up in terms of energy efficiency. Which of these influences, in my experience, are more common? And again, I'm wary of saying which ones are more common because I don't want people to rush straight to utilize those. Those steps of defining what you want people to do and then asking them first always need to happen. But I found it kind of to be 2 or 3 things actually. I find that habits is an important one. People are just used to behaving in certain ways around in terms of computers and lights and so forth. So they need to get into the habit of a new behavior first. There is also something there around what everybody else is doing too. So if everybody else turns the lights off, everybody else turns their computers off, then I think people are more likely to do the same. And I think probably also the way that we set up the infrastructure, so where we locate our lights, if in fact people are able to turn off their computers, where the switches are and so forth, also constrain. So it is kind of, there's probably 3. You could probably also say in some of your cases, it's actually some of the other ones too. A big influencer, I think, which prevents us from engaging people around energy efficiency, and I'll talk more about this later, is that the benefits of being energy efficient to a staff member in an organization are often not immediately apparent to them. Most of the benefits go to the organization in terms of increased dollar savings and so forth. They don't go to the individual staff member. So in some cases, we might need to create the particular incentive. Thank you for those questions. There's a couple more that are coming through, and again, we'll have time at the very end. So I'll hold off answering some of the other questions until we get to the end of the webinar. So, as I said, in our 4-step process here, the first thing that you actually need to do when you're engaging with staff around an energy efficiency issue, or you're trying to get them to change their behaviour, is actually be clear on what you want them to do. Because one of the sins that we as change agents often will do is not to be clear on the behaviour that we are expecting of people. So we need to define it clearly. And you need to be clear on what you want people to do as opposed to what you want them not to do. We probably see lots of stuff that we don't want people to do. Spend a bit of time thinking about what you would actually like them to do instead, so you can offer them an alternative. And it's easier to encourage a positive behavior rather than discourage a negative behavior. It just lends it. It's a more positive atmosphere, a more positive feeling for the program as well, rather than you chastising people and being the bad cop here. It's better to be the person who encourages and engages them around a positive behavior too. I think it makes it slightly more fun as well. And to help you define a behavior or the ask of staff a little bit more clearly, here's 4 prompts. The first, which you use those prompts to be a little bit clear on what you want people to do. So those prompts include, what's the action you want people to do? So if you were to see it, what would that action look like? What would the target of that action be that the action is directed at? What's the context and the time in which the behavior or the action occurs? And very importantly, who do you want to actually perform the behavior or carry out that action? So, and in some cases, or in many cases, it might not be everybody in the organization. You may have a very clearly defined audience, say the cleaners or the fleet managers or something. So it may not be something that you're trying to engage everyone around. The more clearly you can define your audience, the easier it is to understand the behavior from their perspective. Let me give you 2 examples that come from a program that I did a couple of years ago with the YMCA in an aquatic center and in a kindergarten. And this is how they use those particular prompts to define the behaviors that they wanted to see a little bit more clearly. So for the in the aquatic center, there was a behavior that they wanted pool staff, that was the audience, to cover the pool with the pool blanket at closing time. In the kindergarten, it was the room coordinator to turn off the heaters in the rooms at the end of the day. So again, they use these particular prompts to be more clear. Now, you might be wondering, why am I being so anal retentive in asking you to define the behavior? But the clearer that we are about the behavior that we want, the easier it is for us to then communicate to staff of what we would like them to do. And we are guilty of this sin of not defining behaviors clearly. Do the green thing, do the right thing, please think before you print. Lovely catchphrases, but not particularly clear in terms of what behavior we'd like to actually see. Second, the clearer we define a behavior, the easier it is for us to actually monitor whether that's happening or not. And it allows us to see whether or not our programs are actually successful. So a couple of reasons as to why I'm pushing people to define behavior a little bit more clearly too. Once we've done that, the next thing that we want to be thinking about then is to actually consult with or talk to staff about the behavior. Not about, I have seen staff consultation done in organizations around sustainability issues, but it tends to be really broad. It tends to be there, should this organization become sustainable? What do you think? Do you agree or disagree with climate change? Very broad stuff. In this particular case, I'm advocating that you talk to staff about the behavior that you would like to see them see them do. Because it allows you to get better intelligence and it's a better reconnaissance, better data can be gathered. And probably the worst thing we can do before we're designing a behavior change program is to put ourselves into the shoes of the people that we want to engage with. They are not you. You are weird enough to give up your lunch times to listen to a webinar through the CitySwitch program on behavior change around energy efficiency. I would suggest that what motivates you in this particular area will be very different to what motivates your colleagues and the rest of your staff, because they are not like us. What motivates us will not be what motivates them. And the only way you can find that out is to actually go and talk to them. And talk to them about the particular behavior that you would like to see. So you can get a perspective of what might be influencing them to not carry out that behavior, and what you might use to influence them to actually carry out the behaviour. So to dig in to their perspectives and see where some of these categories, which of these categories might actually come up. Now, how you talk to staff and consult with staff, I would suggest is very much up to you, and obviously the culture within your organisation and the size of your organisation as well. That could just be informal, lunchroom chats. It could be a focus group. It could be just a corridor conversation with people that you bump into. It could be some observation. If it's a large organisation and maybe you have many sites, you might want to think about even conducting surveys, and that's certainly what we have done in other organisations in the past, where it's been very large, and surveys have their problems, but the benefit of a survey is it allows you to collect data from a large group of people quickly, and just so that you can see the types of questions that we ask when we conduct surveys, but these are also questions which could influence any way that you're talking or consulting with staff. So the first thing to note from these is we're asking them about the behaviour, as I've said before. The first set of questions asks about what they think are the good stuff and the bad stuff for the individual as a result of performing the behaviour. So what do they benefit from performing the behaviour, and what might be a negative thing if they perform the behaviour. The second set of questions is around trying to get an understanding of the social norms that exist in the place. So who would approve or disapprove of that individual performing the behaviour? And the last is to get a sense of if the environment and the infrastructure is supportive of that particular behaviour. So what do you think enables and hinders, makes it easy or difficult for you to perform the behaviour? You don't need to stick to these, but these are just hopefully, again, some possible prompts and guides to help you in the way that you then talk with staff. So those are the two of the take-home messages I want you to get from today. You need to define the ask, and then you need to talk to staff or consult with them. When you've done that, you're then ready to do the thing that you probably wanted to do from the word go, which is to actually then select different tools and strategies to engage staff when you design some of the different things that they do. And rather than give you a complete download of all this sort of stuff, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a cook's tour on what these things could look like. And you can see there's a large range of things. And again, the CitySwitch website would have a number of these, and I'll point you in that direction later. But you can see none of this becomes appropriate until you get a better sense of staff's perspectives on the behaviour. And once you know that, then hopefully you can start to understand which of these particular tools and resources may actually be appropriate to utilise. But 3 really quick, easy wins for you. One thing around behaviour change is, particularly around energy efficiency, is we often tend to promote it in terms of what we could be saving. It's been found that people are more responsive to loss. So how much you might be losing in terms of dollars or so forth because energy efficiency is not happening could be a more engaging argument to have with people as well. So when you're talking about energy efficiency, talk about loss rather than savings. It's just been found to actually stimulate action a little bit better. People like to be consistent, so if they commit to a behaviour, particularly in public, they're more likely to then follow through on the behaviour. This is a great example that comes from an organisation where they got staff to commit to a particular behaviour and then put it up on the wall in their lunchroom. The feedback I had for this group was if they actually also then put the picture of the staff member next to each of their commitments, it would probably strengthen that even more. But again, a great example of a public commitment, and people find it then a little bit harder to move away from that because it's a commitment they've made in public. And the last quick and easy thing that could just always be the way that you talk to people about energy efficiency and you try and engage with staff is to give the idea that as everyone else is already doing this. This is just the way things like around here happen. It's called a descriptive norm. And a great example of that came actually from some local councils we did some work with a few years ago, where they developed a series of posters around behaviours that they wanted people to do from a sustainability perspective. But the people in these posters are actual staff from the organisation. And not just that, the coloured posters are in fact some of the senior managers from that organisation. Which also gives the added pressure that this isn't just everyone in the organisation doing it, but it's those with authority who are doing that particular behaviour. And again, that just ramps up the likelihood of people following through on the behaviour as well. One thing I did mention around energy efficiency was that people tend to not feel the benefits of being energy efficient in an organisation. It tends to go to the organisation rather than to the individual staff member. So putting an incentive in might be something that's necessary. And there's a great example that comes from some colleagues of mine a few years ago who conducted a nighttime audit. So at about 7 o'clock, they walked through the organisation and they audited who had left their computers on, who'd left their lights on, and who had turned them off. For those that had turned lights off and turned computers off, they left a little note congratulating them on that, and then also left a chocolate. Those that hadn't conducted the behaviour, carried out this particular behaviour, were given a note to remind them, hey, next time please turn your lights off and turn your computer off. That was enough, and it was repeated over 3 or 4 times in the year. That was enough to shift turn-off rates from about 20% to about 80% over that period of time, because a benefit was created for staff to follow through with that particular behaviour. It's a really useful one, and I think it's particularly relevant to energy efficiency because, again, it just makes it advantageous for staff to carry out the behaviour as well. So we're getting pretty much close to the end of this particular webinar. This is just a reminder of some of the things that we covered. And while I go through them, I'll encourage people to type up any other questions that they might have, and I'll respond to them at the end of this slide. So we looked today at some of the different influences of behaviour. We looked at the importance of staff engagement to define what we want people to do and to do that really, really clearly. We then also talked about the importance of actually talking to staff and consulting with staff on the particular behaviour that we want them to carry out. And then I gave you a very quick cook's tour of some possible tools and ideas that you could utilise to engage staff, but none of which are effective until you actually do the first bits, defining the ask and talking to staff, because they give you a better sense of what might be appropriately utilised to engage staff in the particular behaviour that you want them to do. There's a couple of questions that people have. There's 2 more in particular that I want to address here and now. The first is someone has asked, do you let people know, this is in relation to the nighttime audit, do you let people know that you're doing the audit? So my colleagues let people know in the week that the audit was taking place, but they didn't let them know which night of the week. So they gave them a heads up, but they did make it a little bit random in that they didn't tell them which particular night. I think they did it on a Tuesday or Wednesday night. Another question here is actually, will this presentation be circulated? Yes, we will be circulating this presentation through the CitySwitch website, and we'll follow up with you on that as well. The last thing to just flag with you is some of the resources that CitySwitch has already developed to assist you in behaviour change and engaging staff in your organisations in behaviour change. And again, I'll refer you to the CitySwitch website, and there's both some information on the website as well as a number of downloadable resources that you can utilise. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time and your attention today. As Paul said at the beginning of the presentation, this will be a two-part series, and next week we'll be talking about green teams and utilising green teams as, again, vehicles of staff engagement within your organisations. So thank you very much for your time, and have a pleasant day.